Thank you for joining us this week on the show. This is Samantha and Zessie.
Yo, it's Remoy George Phillip, the wide awake master DJ producer. Holla!
Oh my God. Wide awake. That's debatable. I'm just kidding.
Very.
I'm just kidding. And this is masculinity. That is masculinity with a K, as per usual. So, we have a lot of things to talk about today. A lot of things have been popping off, as you know. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about a few things that, in our society have happened that it would be really completely irresponsible for us to ignore, given what topic we're covering. So for weeks, we've come on the show, sometimes just us, sometimes with awesome guests to contribute, to talk about what we can do to create a more just dynamic when it comes to the persona of masculinity, the prescribed role of masculinity. And one resounding action that keeps coming up, is for us to just talk, to have conversations, like talk about what's going on, open up dialogue about the ways that masculinity affects us and affects others. So we're going to be doing just that. Just continue to develop discourse on this topic until it becomes a household conversation, and everyone's goal is to do away with its harmful ways.
Yeah, I think there's what we're discovering and gratefully discovering is that this construct of masculinity that we're here to talk about intersects with our lives and life individually, as a society, and in a shit ton of ways. And it's cool to discover that, because then we can broaden that conversation and more people can be comfortable, not only just like learning, but being able to see and then as well grow that discourse.
So today we'll be talking about ESPN's apology to a commander-in-chief who some would call not my president, which I never actually say that about 45, but that's how I act, because fuck him. We're also going to be talking about the mass shooting that took place in Las Vegas. Craziness. So let's start talking about what happened with ESPN, right? So Jemele Hill, who is a sports anchor on ESPN, called Donald Trump a white supremacist. She has called him a bigot via Twitter. She's been very, very vocal about the way that she feels about homeboy. My first question is why is everybody mad? She's just telling the truth. Where's the lie?
ESPN wants to know their role, and that's supposed to be just comments on sports and primarily sports, and anything that varies too far outside of that into the political or social sphere can get a little bit messy, and they don't want to be messy, and they don't want to mess with the waters.
I feel okay, so let's backtrack here a little bit and just take a quick, let's look at the big picture, the macro snapshot before we really dive into this. So, Jemele Hill is an anchor for SportsCenter, and her job is to relay the sports news and give her opinions, meaning she's a woman giving her opinion on sports. She's a black woman giving her opinion on sports. So first off, Jemele's a trailblazer.
Shout out to Trailblazers.
That's right.
Yeah.
Not Portland. Just want to put that out there. Please continue.
Yeah, I love Damian Lillard. That's all right.
I love him, but
Yeah, she is a trailblazer. She's a woman host who started off as a journalist and got promoted quickly up into being an anchor on SportsCenter. And she's a trailblazer, and shout outs to her. That's for a young man who has watched a lot of SportsCenter in his life, and it was predominantly either Stuart Scott or Dan Patrick, to see a Jemele Hill up there, that is pretty astounding. And to speak to that, Bomani Jones, who is also kind of an ESPN personality and journalist, he made a really astute observation of what Jemele is doing and the challenging place she's in her position. He says, quote, "Discussing sports is a level of privilege afforded to me. People may not like my perspective, but they still think I'm entitled to have it and express it on this platform by virtue of this penis I have."
Incredible.
As a woman, Jones said of Hill, she has to shake off people who have convinced themselves they watch sports to escape their wives or girlfriends. She's catching it worse than anybody else. So that is a very astute observation of the difference between women and men and their roles kind of in the sports universe, right? And the sports news universe specifically.
Honestly, his comments couldn't be more spot on, as we recently heard Cam Newton like sometime this week, talk shit to a journalist who was talking about like routes. I mean, I don't know football, but she was like saying something about like routes and like, did you hear about this?
No.
Cam Newton is like, oh, she like asked him questions about routes. And he's like, oh, it's so funny to hear a female talking about routes. Like, oh, wow, like that's so funny. Before he answers a question. And it's like, homie, like, it was so gross. It was so gross. And like when I first read it, I was like pissed. And then when I actually saw him like say it, because I watched the video, I was like, you're just a fucking idiot. Like, and there's no excuse for this.
Well,
there's no excuse.
It's a similar story to LeVar Ball, Lonzo Ball, the now LA Laker, who has been less than astounding. LeVar Ball saying that when a woman referee was refereeing his son's AAU team game, he told her to stay in her lane, and kind of was very critical, like with a microaggression about her supposed weight or figure or something. And it's the similar thing with Cam Newton and what's happening with Jemele here. There's these isolated incidents that feel isolated, but they actually speak to a bigger situation. But again, to backtrack, for those who don't know, ESPN has had this interesting pivot point over the last few years. All these young people have cord-cutted and are not watching ESPN on the TV or the SportsCenter anymore. We go straight to YouTube or Twitter to get our news, Facebook. And because ESPN is getting less and less attention and losing subscribers and losing advertising opportunities, they've had to adapt. So their best solution as of right now is to bring in all these talking heads and like let them just riff with their opinions and kind of be loud and obnoxious and be controversial, and hopefully that will keep people tuned in. So if that's ESPN's MO, their game plan to have people with loud opinions, then why would you censor someone who was put in position to leverage their opinion, right?
Right.
I mean, Steph Curry, LeBron James, hyper-intelligent Greg Popovich, and even, again, ESPN's infamous, somewhat annoying personality, Stephen A. Smith, have gone on rants against Mr. Trump, but the black woman host can't do her job, whether it's tweeting or whether it's on the air, because why?
Good question. I mean, I feel like my question is like, okay, so this person, these people, right? I don't remember the name of the journalist that Cam Newton is insulted yesterday. I mean, I guess he didn't actually insult her. He just, was being an asshole. But like these people went through a ridiculous vetting process. Like I have looked at what it takes to get hired at ESPN, and I haven't sent in my application because I was like, well, okay, I don't know how that's going to happen. It's like a ridiculous vetting process. So trust, if they're there, is because they're motherfucking qualified. So for you to then be like...
Yeah, but she's a woman, so she's...
Right, so it doesn't matter.
She can't talk about sports. She's disqualified.
It doesn't matter. She can't talk about sports. She can't talk about politics. She can't... I'm just like, first of all, like, why does it hurt you? Why does it hurt you that it's what is so funny about a woman asking you about this? Like, when you watch...
Because women and femininity stay in their lane.
Right. And I guess like what you said about like people, like what Bomani actually said about, like sports being assumed to be something that guys do to get away from their wives or their girlfriends who like constantly nag them and like ask them to put away the dishes and shit. Like if we're still understanding sports as that in that context and like not actually realizing that women watch sports, hello, Exhibit A over here, you know what I'm saying? Then how can we see that Jemele Hill and this other person that Cam Newton disrespected are actually there because they have a stake in the game too? Like they enjoy sports. They're there because, sports is their shit as well. Like if they're actually perceived in a bigger context as being like wives and girlfriends and sisters that homies need to get away from when they go and watch the game.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to this issue, and it's huge because we look at sports and it's kind of this lame kind of practice we do in society generally. Like we have women's sports now, so we have like the WNBA, right? And that's progress. We've made progress, and then we close the envelope, we shelve it, we say that's progress, and we put it away and we archive it, right? But what we're getting here is bigger than that. Like sports is playing like a vehicle to a much bigger discussion of gender roles, and more importantly in this, can women have an opinion? let's
I
forget.
can't believe we're still having this fucking conversation about women having opinions.
Let's forget what the opinion is about. You know, whether it's critiquing LeBron James' game or whether it's critiquing our president and his actions and his words. The bigger question is, can Jemele Hill, a woman, have an opinion? Can a woman come out with a strong opinion? And a better, more precise question is, are women only supposed to have an opinion about things within a woman's world? Doing the dishes, being the girlfriend or the wife. But when it comes to real issues, men's issues, sports, politics, are women just supposed to remain silent? Should Jemele and all women just stay in their lane?
Well, I think one thing that you're pointing out that I think is huge is, are women only supposed to have opinions about issues that affect women? And in my opinion, we're not even supposed to have that, right? Because it's like, if you take a look at issues that actually affect women, it's like reproductive rights, women's hygiene products still having a luxury tax. I can guarantee you that a woman did not put that role in effect at all. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I feel like it's similar to, I mean, I think it's akin to what you were just saying, you know, before we started the podcast, is that women are there to be supporting roles next to what men are creating in our society. That is what we are supposed to do in this society. And I think that, I mean, besides the fact that it's extremely short-sighted and dumb and that we're actually never going to progress if we continue to have that mindset, because we have seen around the world societies where women are not doing well. We see what happens in those societies and the way that they stay back. Like, we see it. So besides the fact that, you know, it's short-sighted, it's also like, there's an impact to dehumanizing half of your population. And I think that what we're not really connected to is the way that it's going to affect the future generations that we have. Like, you know, if you have, you know, you're in a family and you're, you know, looking at ESPN and Jemele Hill is up there doing her shit or whatever, and like, you know, you see your president the president's administration go at the podium or whatever during a press conference and say she should be fired for having an opinion, that kid growing up is going to be like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess women aren't supposed to have opinions because his commander-in-chief is saying it. And I think that there's like a lightness, a lack of responsibility, which I think most people can agree with right now, that the White House in general is taking in terms of, or a lack of responsibility that's showing up in the White House in terms of like everything, but specifically the ways in which like micro units of like families, of schools, of like relationships in this country are impacted by the kind of shit that's being said at that leadership level.
How this intersects with masculinity, right? Like, so we're touching on these points that women are treated as second-class humans, second-class citizens. They're only here to be an accessory to serve men, right? So that reinforces this perceived notion that masculinity are at the top of the social status, or social hierarchy, right? What's problematic is that it dehumanizes women, and then like Samantha was kind of pointing out that if a young girl kind of sees this and...
or a young boy.
No, well, yeah, if a young girl sees this and then feels dehumanized and doesn't feel empowered, then that's a problem, right? But what you're just saying is that what it also does is it reinforces this idea for young boys to treat women as second-class citizens, right? And that's what's scary to me, is that luckily there is criticism out there, and luckily there's these conversations that challenge that ideology. Otherwise, you're going to have boys and young men who see this and see that that is just normal, and that is how the world is supposed to be. And it reinforces these negative ideas of social hierarchy that, again, vault men and masculinity to the top and give them the privilege of being human while disenfranchising anybody else and not allowing them the right to feel their own humanity.
Right.
And be in tune and in touch with all the rights and privileges of what it means to be human. And that, in this case, is having a fucking opinion, whether it's about sports, whether it's about your president, whether it's about who you want to love or how you choose to live. everybody else is a second-class citizen in comparison to what it means to be masculine.
Yeah, I posted for people who follow me on Facebook. I posted a video about how people don't give a shit about facts. They have their opinions and they have the way that they stand, and then that's where they go. And I think that's actually, they look for facts to sustain their opinions rather than basing their opinion on facts. And I think this will become more relevant as we move on to our next topic, which Las Vegas. The Las Vegas shooting happened. You know, first of all, I hope that all of you guys and the people close to you, the people you love are all right. You know, after this man went and shot up this country festival. Last I heard, it was 500 people were injured. 59 people are dead as a result of this disaster. You know, why? Why go on this rampage? Why go and shoot up a country music festival? I mean, I really want to think that, like, this is going to be some interesting, like, you know, twist or whatever to this story, and there's going to be some ridiculous motive that's like completely out of this world, and like there's going to be something new, something we've never heard of behind this fool coming through and killing hella people he doesn't know. But honestly, I feel like we know what's coming, right? Like, is this just another dude? And, you know, some might say, you know, serial killer, another white dude, right? Taking his revenge on society. I mean, I think we all remember Elliot Rodger from Santa Barbara, this student who called it retribution, right? He like put this video out the day before he like went and killed a bunch of people, and it was about him having retribution over the fact that he had been denied sex and denied relationships from women his entire life, and was basically taking revenge on everyone who rejected him, right?
I mean, this is kind of not frustrating, just unfortunate, like, subject matter, and it's a sad story. And like living in a world that in a modern media world that is so interested in like true crime and trying to get to the solution and understand the truth and stuff. I don't know if we'll get there, and you know, it's probably going to be not as rational as we like, and it's not going to be as summed up as we like. But I think what's more interesting here, or not more interesting, just interesting enough, is that a lot of times it's codified for masculinity to find channels to express itself through aggression and violence. And it's codified throughout society, whether, again, it's in the media that we consume, whether it's in the news that we see, whether it's in the video games that we play. Like, everything that intersects with masculinity speaks to the fact that the way that we communicate our pain is through aggression and through violence. And I wonder what it would look like if it weren't that way.
Me too.
So if Elliot Rodger is so sad and hurt and in pain and feels violated by women and society, the only channel he could see being cathartic enough to communicate his pain was to be in that type of violence. And maybe it's the case for Stephen Paddock. Maybe there's some issue with his partner or some pain he had felt through whatever that was the impetus for him to take out such horrible violence in Vegas. But what if there was just a different way that he could see to communicate his pain? Like, don't get me wrong. Like, when I'm upset, I've said this before, I like to hit stuff. I want to throw things. And maybe that's not just a masculine thing. Like, you've spoken to the fact that it's a human thing. Like, maybe we just all need, that's the way that we know. But, or is that more of a nurture thing? Like, that's the only way we've been taught to communicate. And then it becomes a product of violence begetting more violence. And we're just continually replicating that system of communication.
What you're saying is brilliant, because it's like, okay, so, you know, like, what if there was another way to channel it, right? And what I want to get to is, like, also, like, the source of your anger. Because, you know, I get the part of, like, him being angry that, like, you know, he hadn't had romantic relationships and all of that. And I also want to point out that it takes a special kind of hate to go out and murder a bunch of people based on the fact that you're sad. You know what I'm saying? About like being rejected. Like, I think like, you know, there's a certain type of entitlement because essentially his pain and his anger is rooted in the fact that he doesn't have things that he feels he should have. He doesn't have, you know, like everybody else is getting to enjoy, you know, like sexual relationships. Everybody else is getting to enjoy like love and all of that. And I'm not saying that, you know, humans inherently should feel like they're not entitled to it. I think that there's a difference though between merit and deserving and entitlement. And I think that with Elliot Rodgers specifically, he was like, well, what the fuck? Like, I'm entitled to this. And the fact that I don't have it means that all of you guys have to die tomorrow. Why am I bringing this up? Because the link between domestic abuse or sexual harassment and serial killers have some roots in the things that we were talking about in terms of men and violence and masculinity and violence. And I think like what there is to look at is the cause of those things, right? The silence, the lack of compassion, and the entitlement.
Like, what's hard here is like, I think a lot of people, I've always said this, like, I wish life was more like pop-up video. Like growing up, I grew up in a place that was predominantly Caucasian. And so there was a lot of like microaggressions and racist kind of comments said or jokes made that like, I'm not racist, and like I was by myself, so I couldn't identify these things. And so I wish pop-up video was around to be like, racism. And I'd be like, oh, so this is what racism feels. And I think a lot of women go through that. Like when you get catcalled or a guy says something and you're like, oh, sexism. Oh, but sometimes it's so hard because it's in the moment and it's experiential and you don't have the tools to step back and understand that, right? But then when it comes to this, the same thing applies to me. Like I have been verbally abusive to partners. I have been domineering to partners. But to me, in the moment, it just means like I'm upset and I only know how to communicate this loudly and passionately. And in the moment, I'm not understanding what I'm doing. But then once I step back, I understand like, God damn it, like that is very sad that I was verbally abusive to this partner. But for more context and to step back even further to have a greater understanding is like, yo, I'm a 6-foot dude that's like 200 pounds. My partner is 5'3", $125, and she is in a space with a larger individual just speaking down to her with a deep, loud voice coming at her. That is threatening. So to give it more context, it'd be like me having to deal with like LeBron James just yelling at me constantly and like getting riled up. I think any average dude would be like, oh, fuck, I'm scared. I'm intimidated. Like that's how to contextualize like how simple verbal abuse can be. I didn't know it at the time, but then when I'm grounded with that kind of context, it's like, oh yeah, I'm just naturally a bigger human being than this woman in this moment, but she encounters this all the time. And I'm just exacerbating that, and I'm enacting this sort of violence, whether it was my intent or not. And then to have that tool of kind of context helps to better understand what women are feeling and what they are saying and what that abuse kind of actually is. And it's not just a word, and it's not just a social issue, but it's a real thing that people feel, and it's real situations that we can be in, and we have to learn how to be bigger than that.
I really appreciate you saying that because like I have been in those situations and I felt like I didn't realize that I was being verbally abused until after the fact. And I was in a similar situation where like, you know, I'm like 5'6", right? And I'm dealing with somebody who's like, I was dealing with someone who was like, you know, 6'3", and like, or, you know, or taller or shorter or whatever, but like somebody who's bigger than me. I'm dealing with a man who is like, and I'm just trying to like defend myself, or I'm just trying to like say whatever I need to say to get them off my back so that I no longer feel it like I'm no longer in a situation where I feel threatened, you know? And it's like when I'm in that position, there's no rationale. I can't think to myself, oh, this person is being verbally abusive toward me. Let me say what I need to say to disarm them, or let me say what I need to say to have them realize that the behavior they're exhibiting is abusive and that I feel threatened. Because in that moment, they're trying to get their point across to me in a way that I'm like back against the wall and I have no choice but to acquiesce. And I'm trying to get away from being against the wall so that I can feel like myself again. You know, whether you're dealing with your significant other or, you know, another person who's important to you, you want to make sure that you're heard. You also want to make sure that like you hear yourself and that you're not crazy, right? That like in that instance, you're being validated. So I venture to say that like somebody who is the dominant person in that position, in that situation, you know, like a Stephen Paddock saying that shit to, you know, his significant other, or like, you know, a boyfriend yelling at his girlfriend or whatever, or, you know, whatever the situation is, there's no conception of that. And I think part of what we're doing here in this podcast is to really bring context to that so that, you know, number one, this notion of entitlement, this notion of like, you know, as a man, I have a right to say what I have to say, and you just have to listen to what I'm saying. And like that's on a micro level when you're in a relationship with someone else and it's like a twosome trying to deal with the situation, to then, you know, taking that out to kill, you know, 49 people because you're trying to make a point about what you're entitled about. This article, this Quartz article that I posted on the Facebook yesterday talks about it brilliantly. They're like, so this Stephen Paddock thing happens. We're going to talk about gun control. Eventually, we're going to talk about how we're going to realize that he somehow abused this girl, right? Then we're going to talk about how there's a link for like 5 minutes. And then we're going to go on with our lives. At what point are we going to be like, okay, what the fuck is going on in Stephen Paddock's life that he needs to open up fire on 500 something people?
Well, okay, to play devil's advocate then, if we're going to give Jemele Hill the right to tweet whatever her opinion is, where is there the space to discuss what white supremacy is? If she's going to call somebody a white supremacist, and for people not for that to mean a million things to a million different people, then why is that okay? Because it's not giving anybody the space to that. So it's hard in this divisive society where everybody's allowed to have their individual opinion, but not to have the space or time to contextualize that, or not to give them, to not be responsible enough to understand that and have the context for what they're saying communicated as well. Obviously, that's what's going to happen.
I think we have to decide as a society like what we're willing to stand for. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you know, you have somebody who opens up fire on people, on a bunch of people. I mean, Donald Trump has barely said shit about this. Like, I'm sorry about the people in Vegas and whatever. I think he said something like, oh, Stephen Paddock was a sick individual. We're dealing with somebody who was demented. And that was the fuck that. And I'm like, how many mass shootings do we have to have before somebody is like, okay, what is behind the mass shooting and what are we going to implement systematically to deal with it? I'm talking about white supremacy.
What is white supremacy?
White supremacy is the belief that white people should be the dominant culture and that people who are not white should not be present in that society.
See, that's not how I fully interpret white supremacy. There is that kind of explicit extreme white supremacy, but also there's the idea of white supremacy as in whiteness, or we could just simplify it, unfortunately oversimplify and call it Americanness, just being the dominant standard.
But go ahead.
And so anybody, brown, black, yellow, red, can implement that type of white supremacy in their day-to-day life, not even knowing it, and still be implementing white supremacy.
Okay, so you mean like internalized, like, because I mean when you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is like, so, you know, internalized racism. Like if I'm, you know, I mean I'm, you know, French Cameroonian, now American or whatever. If I'm implementing like white supremacy or implementing like, I guess Americanness, which is really like a cloak for white supremacy, then I'm inherently deeming myself to be inferior and like moving that way through the country or through my life.
Just for example's sake, if we were to say a person, a culture, or an individual who's eating their food with their hands versus using a fork and knife, right?
Right, yeah.
And just kind of looking down upon the person who eats with their hands, but that's their natural thing. That in of itself is employing this idea of white superiority or white supremacy.
Yeah.
Or this is not the proper way because that is not the American way. And anybody can employ that. So, and it affects all aspects of culture. So when people live in a 140-character world without any context for what they're saying, and that information is going to hit the masses and be interpreted and understood and misunderstood in a million different ways, how do you expect there to be any sort of progress?
Well, I think that's where we have to come together and define what we like. I mean, we have to basically define.
That's an easy solution. Come together. How do you bring all these people together?
So what we can do is really take a look. I mean, that's all I can think of is like we have to like be able to decide what we are going to call American. I'm not ever going to be somebody who says that Americanness is white, because it's not. I mean, at least from what I can tell, like, first of all, the first people who were in America, I mean, I guess before it was called America, weren't white. America has never existed with just white people. Not ever. So it's like, I feel like that's like an erasure of society. And I mean, I know that there are people who don't agree because we saw what the hell happened in Charlottesville. And I mean, I can't separate myself from that. And I mean, I don't know if I were white, if I would feel differently. You know, I can't speak to that. But I really do think like as a society, we're going to have to decide what we're going to tolerate because, you know, and I really do think that it stems from leadership. I mean, Donald Trump is I mean, the fact that he is able to exist, the fact that he is able to be president speaks volumes, right? And then you have shit like the Stephen Paddock guy comes on. I told you, like I told you before we started the episode, like I was listening to CNN. You should have heard the way that they were talking about this dude. Like, yeah, like maybe he had, and I really thought actually that there was some problem, like something with mental illness. Then I researched. There's no actual like evidence of the fact that this guy actually had any kind of like diagnosis of mental illness, but people automatically go to that because he's a white guy. Yeah, and I'm like, you look at Trayvon Martin, homeboy is walking around with, how old was he, 14? With Skittles in his pocket, and he is dead.
No, I think you're speaking.
Stephen Paddock is only, I'm sorry, I'm like super hyped, but Stephen Paddock is only dead right now because he killed his motherfucking self.
Right.
If he had not killed himself, he would be standing trial. I guarantee it. And, you know, when we talk about like compassion, we talk about like mental illness, we talk about like, you know, this context of masculinity and like who gets mental illness, who gets compassion, who gets like there's a stratification with like within that too, racially, like in terms of sexual orientation, all of that. And I think like it would be completely irresponsible for us not to address it.
There is a stratification within masculinity, and it's interesting to even go like kind of that micro and like use a fine-tooth comb to kind of scrape through there and understand that there are individuals who employ masculinity, but some who benefit more from it and get more compassion in this case. And what you're kind of pointing to is the fact that in these kind of mass shooting kind of situations where at least the evidence shows that predominantly it's white men who are employing this incensed violence against unfortunate bystanders, they get not necessarily like an explicit compassion. And we're not saying that they are like, oh, poor guys. But what we are saying is they get to have their story told without being conveyed, whether it's through microaggressions or through tone, that they are just threatening individuals.
Right.
While on the contrary, if you look at African-American violence or black violence or brown violence being with the connotation of being terrorists and so on and so forth, they aren't afforded that same kind of compassion.
They're not. And honestly, if we're going to get real, I actually think that's why, even though there are actually like doing a little bit of research on it, there are a lot more serial killers who are not white than we know, than is actually like presented to us in the media. And I think that's why. I think that is because, you know, men in general aren't necessarily going to like, aren't going to be prioritized as receiving compassion, right? But when they do get compassion, it has to be because they're mentally ill. You know what I'm saying? But then who gets to be mentally ill? You know what I'm saying? Like, who was it? Oh my God, there's a woman who got killed. She's a black woman. I think her name is Tori. She was killed. She had a child. She was mentally ill. She was diagnosed as mentally ill. She came out. She's trying to protect her child. The cops killed her, cold blood, in front of her kid. And, you know, it's like, where was the compassion then? You know, Dylan Roof, when he killed 9 people, he's a serial killer. He got to stop at Burger King on his way to the fucking station. You know, and it's like, it's shit like that I'm just like, you know, if we're going to talk about compassion, and I mean, I want to be very, very, very clear, extremely clear, that everyone deserves compassion. Everybody deserves the right to have access to adequate mental health care. Everybody deserves that. That's white people, black people, and everybody in between. I'm not saying like, you know, that I'm saying that everybody deserves it. I'm saying that, you know, if we're going to give Stephen Paddock that look, which it deserves. I mean, if he killed somebody, if he killed like a bunch of people, like we need to take a look at like what kind of psychological situation is happening that can happen. We also need to be looking at like mental illness, like in like, you know, crime when somebody who is not white is doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's what we're trying to say is like the lens has to change a little bit, and there have to be different lenses that focus in very specifically and understand what's happening in the way that we communicate crimes and violence. If it's black on black violence, it's almost just like, oh, it's normal. That's what black people do. They're criminals.
There you go.
They're gangsters.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah.
If brown people shoot white people, they're terrorists or they're immigrants.
Yeah.
And that's who they are. They're innately that. They are less than human. They are those monsters. But when Stephen Paddock murders 59 people, well, there has to be a reason. Why did he do it? Why? Like there has to be. It can't just be, no.
A normal guy like that, I mean, he was great, you know?
And that level of normalcy that's afforded him, and it's a sad story, don't get me wrong, and
of course.
it's extremely sad. Just I try to want to understand why he did that. But to afford him the right of the reasons why, and that there could be a real reason to that, versus just being another black kid who gets shot or a brown kid just being a terrorist. That's kind of unfortunate, and that's very sad. But we have to shift our lens, and we have to see it like that first. We have to be very critical of the way that society and media not only looks at masculinity and femininity, but within masculine privilege, who gets afforded what rights innately almost, and who doesn't.
You know, what's important to me is equality. That's why we're here. You know, when we say equality, I think like it's not just equality in like pay wages. It's not just equality in whatever. It's equality in like compassion, right? So like if we're talking about like gender equality, for example, women should get paid the same way that the men do. They should have, you know, like Jemele Hill should be able to say whatever the fuck she wants to say, you know, and men should get the compassion just as much as women do. You know, they should be able to have spaces that they can, you know, discuss their trauma, discuss, you know, their frustrations, discuss their ostracization and their bullying, whatever they've gone through. And I think if we're talking about true equality, we have to be able to, you know, provide a context in which we talk about things like what it means to be American and how, you know, the stratification within that needs to be done away with. You know what I'm saying? Like, if we're going to be a society that actually talks about like the land of the free and like, you know, equality and freedom and all of that, then we need to walk our talk. And, you know, the aim of this podcast is to, you know, obviously use masculinity and, you know, that persona and that construct as, you know, a lens through which to just not let ourselves off the hook. Like compassion does not supersede accountability. And accountability is a form of love. Accountability is a form of support.
Yeah, I think we've covered two kind of news cycle stories, but we've given them the space to breathe and really kind of deconstruct and understand better and contextualize and maybe not necessarily agree at times or just get really emotional about, because these are very deep human stories that affect us all. And we're trying to get at a better place of understanding. And it's cool because it's coming through a place of conversation and discourse. And we're both willing, and we're all willing to a certain degree to try to understand one another. So thank you for listening. It is super important. This conversation, we wholeheartedly believe, is important, that we can better understand masculinity and gender, but each other as whole humans. To keep this conversation going, please spread the word. We need your help. I mean, I don't know what we all think about podcasts like they just happen, right? But we need listeners, and we need the conversation to go forward. So we need you as a listener to listen, but also to help spread the word. You can find us on iTunes. You can find us on Libsyn. You can find us on Stitcher. You can kind of find us on SoundCloud.
Yeah, SoundCloud stuff, but yeah.
Find us, give us some reviews. You can follow us on Facebook at Masculinity Podcast. That's Masculinity K Podcast. And you can also find us on Twitter at Masculinity Pod, again with the K. And that way you can like what we post. You can comment. You can see what we're posting and then comment on that and keep the discussion going. Whether you agree or disagree, we can keep this conversation going. It's not a one-sided conversation. We need your help. And we honestly believe in this conversation, and we believe it's very important.
Listen, just want to shout out to you, Remoy, because you're an amazing partner in this conversation. And honestly, I feel like things are getting very real out here, and I feel like for me, like, this conversation is really do or die. I just want to say I appreciate you, man.
Yo, shout out to my homie, but friend first, Samantha and Remoy. Again, my name is Remoy Phillip, and this has been Masculinity. Thanks for listening.
Ciao.
Peace.